Greetings, intrepid system failure listeners. Nate here with your weekly essay read, this one entitled Forgiveness versus Foreclosure, and subtitled How Debt Forgiveness Could Have Saved Rome. But first, a little preamble. Death and rebirth are central themes of Christianity, both in its mythology, the story of Jesus is about coming back from the dead, and its actual history. Christianity resurrected some notable Jewish and Greco-Roman traditions, dusted them off, and transported them forward into the Middle Ages and beyond. Three major examples, all readily allegorized by death and rebirth, are debt forgiveness, astronomical cycles, and ego death. Christianity originated within the Roman Empire, which, according to its own historians, eventually collapsed because of debt. The Romans were pioneers in foregoing the stability afforded by systematic debt forgiveness. From Mesopotamia to classical Greece, preceding societies had used it to stave off economic collapses like the one that eventually befell Rome. The Mesopotamian tradition arrived in the Roman Empire via Jewish scripture and, amazingly, the figure of Jesus. However, Rome's fate was sealed when the financial forgiveness he preached was conveniently reinterpreted to mean forgiveness for sexual immorality instead. That's how the fall of Rome shaped Christianity as we recognize it today. And now the main essay, Forgiveness versus Foreclosure. The dangers of debt. According to its own historians, Roman society collapsed because of debt. In the aftermath of the fall of Rome, debt got such a bad name that the Roman Catholic Church considered usury a sin for 1,000 years. Livy, Plutarch, and other Romans, wrote Dr. Michael Hudson in And Forgive Them Their Debts, blamed Rome's decline on creditors using fraud, force, and political assassination to impoverish and disenfranchise the population. Unquote. Too much wealth inequality is an existential threat to any society. To prevent their civilizations from becoming consumed by it, the kings of Bronze Age Mesopotamia established a long tradition of regular debt forgiveness. In the 6th century BC, that idea reached as far west as Greece. But then Rome broke with Athens by engaging in the risky practice of unprotected finance. In their 1944 classic, Caesar and Christ, legendary historians Will and Ariel Durant wrote, "Wealth mounted, but it did not spread. In 104 BC, a moderate Democrat reckoned that only 2,000 citizens owned property." Unquote. 4 or 5 million propertyless people lived at the mercy of just a couple thousand elites who owned everything. That hideous wealth inequality ultimately removed any incentive for most Romans to defend their society from external threats. No one wanted to fight or die for a society in which they didn't share the spoils. Roman slavery. Slavery was the specific mechanism by which debt destroyed Rome. As Roman society expanded militarily, slaves were a highly sought-after commodity. Precious metals and other non-slave commodities could be looted for conquered territories and sold once. But slaves captured from those territories generated income for a lifetime. About a quarter of the Roman population was enslaved at any one time. And about half of those enslaved worked on the latifundia, or massive slave farms, where Rome's food was grown. Rome's small farmers were ruined when agricultural produce grown by slaves hit the grain markets. They couldn't hope to compete with slave labor. The generals and politicians who owned the latifundia didn't have to pay their farmhands. They could afford to sell their slave-grown grain at a price far below that which free farmers could afford to sell theirs. The introduction of slaves, in other words, rendered the free farms of Rome economically non-viable. The introduction of slavery dramatically altered the economic landscape of Rome, particularly in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC. Through no fault of their own, the small farms tilled by free Roman citizens passed from economic viability to financial ruin during that time. Foreclosure. The Roman oligarchy established an innovative set of legal principles to preserve the sanctity of assets like debt. We still use their legal system today. Our legal terms are all in Latin, the language of Rome. As the small farmers of Rome were ruined en masse, the Roman legal system transferred all those farms to creditors. The mortgage contracts for those farms were written when the profits were sufficient to make the mortgage payments. But after the introduction of slavery removed those profits, mortgage contracts defaulted and a wave of foreclosures broke over Roman society. During the foreclosure proceedings, the unconscious logic of Roman jurisprudence systematically delivered the bulk of Rome's small farms to creditors who were already wealthy. Their legal system was utterly blind to the dire consequences of extreme wealth inequality. Forgiveness. The Bronze Age kings of Mesopotamia understood that there was an alternative to the dangers of extreme wealth inequality. That alternative was constantly writing down debt to match the actual ability of debtors to repay it. Or, in other words, to forgive those debts. Solon of Athens used that strategy in Greece. However, the Romans became historical pioneers by not forgiving debt and instead upholding its sanctity with a rigid legal system. Forgiveness was central to the message of Jesus Christ, who lived out his short life on the outer rim of the Roman Empire. During his debut sermon in his hometown of Nazareth, Jesus read a passage from Jewish scripture commanding debt forgiveness. Furthermore, his Lord's Prayer contains the line, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." Jesus advocated for the precise economic reform that could have prevented the economic turmoil he and his contemporaries lived through. A different legal system might have taken into account the fact that slavery had radically changed the economic paradigm and that small farmers were defaulting on their mortgages by no fault of their own. If it had written down their debts to match their actual ability to pay, Rome's free farmers could have remained on their farms instead of being forced off their property and into urban slums. Under a forgiveness scenario, Rome's wealthy creditors would have been forced to take a haircut on the debts owed to them. Said another way, they would have had to recognize a portion of the economic losses caused by their widespread deployment of slaves. Instead, they double-dipped. The Roman elite kept all the profits for the latifundia for themselves, and then took over the farms of those whom the latifundia ruined. It was a recipe for social and economic chaos. The worst nightmares of the kings of Mesopotamia came true in Rome. The 2008 financial crisis. During the 2008 financial crisis, America faced a similar choice between forgiveness and foreclosure. The root of that crisis was the fraudulent issuance of subprime mortgages to lenders who could ill afford them. When it turned out that lenders had been writing unpayable loan contracts, the worldwide economic system imploded. We addressed the problem by purchasing distressed debt from investment banks using public funds, which is the essence of quantitative easing. Throughout its history, the U.S. Federal Reserve was limited to buying only U.S. Treasury bonds, which was known as open market operations. However, following the 2008 financial crash, new legislation permitted the government to acquire mortgage-backed securities directly from investment banks at face value. Approximately $4.5 trillion worth of public funds were used to allocated to quantitative easing between 2008 and 2014. We could have, however, simply forgiven the unpayable mortgages causing the issue. That would have cost an order of magnitude less public money. But just as in Rome, wealthy creditors wield enormous influence over our government and prefer foreclosures over forgiveness. As a result of their policy preference, some 10% of all U.S. mortgages went into foreclosure during the 2008 financial crisis. We're still grappling with the same political and economic forces that once preoccupied Jesus and toppled the Roman Empire. In one of his epistles, the Roman poet Horace wrote, "Mutato nomine, de te fabula narrator." That means, change the name, and the story is about you. Well, alrighty, folks, that concludes this week's essay read. If you like this essay and you'd like to read more like it, or even enter your email to receive these essays weekly on Mondays in your email inbox, you can accomplish all of that at systemfailure.org. If you'd like to get into contact with me or with Brian, you can also accomplish that over at systemfailure.org. And with that, I will sign off and see you all on Monday for our regularly scheduled System Failure podcast with Brian. See you then, folks.